Well, yes, my full self-driving supervised free trial expired a little bit ago. A lot of people were questioning, well, is it worth it now at $100 a month? Or, Drew, do you miss having it? Do you see yourself using it in the future? And I gotta admit, Tesla picked a perfect month for me at least to hand out a free trial because I clocked over 2,000 miles with full self-driving 12.3.3, and then about halfway through the trial, I got 12.3.6, which at that time was basically the latest version available. And I gotta admit, the experience is quite fascinating. It's quite interesting to watch the computer look around, figure out its surroundings, and decide what the best way to handle it is. And I'll even admit, it impressed me quite a few times. Particularly when I was recording its performance for this video. When we first got it, it was only just a couple of minutes into our first drive that it started making mistakes. Particularly when it needs to get over into the left lane to make a turn, but there's not quite a left turn lane. There were multiple instances where it would get into the suicide lane, then realize that it's not supposed to be there, then try to move back into the lane it was without signaling, and there were cars behind me, so I had to take over. And again, that was just a couple minutes into the drive. So I remembered and marked down a few of these places where FSD kind of screwed up and said, I'm gonna go back and record those instances. But after I got the 12.3.6 update, it actually didn't make the same mistake in that same place. There were some other more repeatable offenses though, like there's a specific piece of highway that I drive on pretty frequently where it consistently gets into the right turn lane, and this is not like a classic exit. This is a hardcore 90-degree right turn that you start at 70 miles per hour in, and you have to slow down and take a really hard right, so you gotta slow down a lot, and the car still, for some reason, wants to take this lane, even when the navigation says we don't have a right turn for miles. And it still made that mistake even on the latest version. Very uncomfortable for everybody else in the car for you to have to take over, quickly jump it back into the main lane, otherwise it would end up in a ditch because it was definitely not slowing down fast enough. And it also did this on a recent road trip I did with FSD, except for the left turn lane. Once again, I don't understand what confuses it because the visualization literally shows the left turn arrow on the street, so it should be aware that this is a left turn only lane, and I'll have, another 10 miles before we even need to think about merging, and without a warning and without a signal, it just suddenly will get into the left turn lane. And again, it's one of those lanes that takes a drastic 90-degree turn that you really have to slow down for. Not to mention, is it throwing me off course, but it's also quite dangerous because it still wants to maintain highway speed when it drastically would need to slow down. But again, it's not supposed to be going that way anyway. But aside from edge cases like that, I'll admit I did have quite a few zero intervention drives, particularly when I was visiting Gregor Truck over in Phoenix. I get the feeling that full self-driving handles cities, actually, particularly square cities that kind of just have a grid of stoplights and intersections. Those, I think it's very well trained for because at the end of the day, it is kind of simple. You stop at the red light, and then when the light turns green, you are free to go, assuming there's no pedestrians or any other cars doing weird things. There were definitely times where at certain intersections, it would not stay in its right turn lane. It would stretch into another lane, which can be dangerous if there were other cars around. I wonder though, would the system perform differently if there were cars around? Because pretty much it only made that lane change mistake when no other cars were around. So technically, yes, it is an illegal right turn, like you would get pulled over for that kind of thing, but there was no cops around and there were no other cars around. It performed the maneuver safely despite being against the law. It's really got to inch out now. Oh, stopping. You're clear. You gotta go. You gotta go, car. Go. Oh, man. Maybe it heard me. All right. It's going. I actually found it struggling to understand when to accelerate and slow down more so than the steering. I felt like in most situations, I was not having to grab the steering wheel. Most of the time, if I was intervening with the car, it was because I was getting impatient. It was confusing other cars around me, and that brings me to a lot of its performance at stop signs, which unfortunately, when you live in a rural area like I do, and you're not making a lot of stops at places where you have great visibility or you have perfect right angles to look down the street, this is where I had to intervene the most, but it certainly resulted in a lot of, come on, we gotta go, you're going too slow. So I would push on the accelerator a lot, not so much take over the steering. Typically, it knew how hard it needed to turn and how to not end up in the oncoming traffic lane, but it was a lot more hesitant at stop signs, which is partially to blame to the NHTSA forcing Tesla to come to a complete stop at 0 miles per hour at every single stop sign, which is not human-like behavior, and that in itself resulted in a lot of confusion among other drivers because they see you come to a complete stop, which is unnatural, and then they want you to go because they can tell that it's clear. The cameras on the car, however, cannot, unfortunately, because of the camera positioning Tesla has opted to go with, and sadly, it doesn't seem to change all that much with hardware 4 either. Here's one of those blind corners where it can barely see. I can't even see that well, but oh, it's really got to creep out. All right, and it went. That's good. That's good. Because the repeater cameras are kind of behind where your head is, there's a lot of intersections or stop signs where a human would naturally lean forward and look down both ways of the road to make sure that it's clear. But the car's cameras, while they do have a much more surround sound view than our human eyes do, they're mounted so far back that the car straight up cannot see in a lot of situations that a car is or isn't coming. And that results in a lot of double stops at stop signs where it stops way too far behind the line, probably because the NHTSA. But the second mistake it makes is more on Tesla's camera positioning, where it has to creep and creep and creep. And in a lot of situations, you can tell there's not a car coming for miles and miles and miles, but because the cameras are mounted, behind where my eyes are, it can't tell that it's clear. So it has to just keep creeping and creeping until it's absolutely sure that there's no other cars coming. And honestly, that can take a while. It can be an unnatural amount of time. It probably doesn't feel right when you're just watching footage that I'm posting in this video, but when you're in the situation, or especially if there's someone behind you waiting, it becomes a lot more noticeable because it'll start creeping into the intersection, and sometimes you can see a car that's coming and the car can't, so it'll keep on creeping, and that makes the car coming slow down or get confused or honk at you. So that's typically a situation where I would either hit the brakes or tell everybody else in the car don't worry, it'll stop, we'll be okay, and that just makes everybody uncomfortable, even though you might technically have that experience multiple times on a zero disengagement drive. And when it does finally notice that a car is coming, it has to come to a complete stop a second time, and then it starts creeping again. It just gets really annoying very quickly, and sadly where I live there is a crap ton of stop signs. I experience that double stop issue very, very frequently, and honestly a lot of those issues with the double stop problem don't seem like things that Tesla can easily solve, because the first stop being way behind the line is a problem with the federal government mandating that the robotaxis drive a certain way. The second problem has to do with the hardware in the car physically not being capable of seeing as far down the road as I can. And if we expect these things to drive safer than a human, I would expect it should probably be able to see better than a human, but I don't know, there's probably a lot of major cities where they're not worried about it because it can rely mostly on stoplights telling it when to go and when to stop. But in more rural areas, I do question about the regulatory approval and the safety performance of it, which I could imagine already is probably vastly different depending on where you use it. In a major city with a lot of training data, maybe it is 10 times safer than a human, but in a more rural area with a lot of blind corners where you can't see as well, that might make it still not even close to as safe as a human because of its visibility issues and the amount of creeping it has to do to get into intersections. As a feature advertising to a consumer, it's fun to watch what the car can do, but I can't shake the feeling the whole time that this is ultimately still a party trick. I showed FSD off to my family and friends, and they often were like, whoa, this is really weird, that's crazy, but none of them ever had the impression of, wow, I need to go out and buy one of these cars, or I would definitely pay for this feature, mainly because of how much it throttled, especially the unnaturally fast acceleration, even with chill mode on, or the unnaturally close deceleration where it's like, is it gonna stop? Is it gonna stop? And it usually does stop in time, but not as natural as a human would stop, and that made a lot of people in the car uncomfortable. Like, really, Drew? Are you gonna keep FSD on the entire time? Because because it keeps throwing my head back in the seat. So that obviously didn't impress a lot of my friends and family members, but I'm glad the prices have come down. I think that the lower the price, honestly, the better for these features. The data right now, at least, is suggesting that even after this 30-day free trial, the uptick in FSD has not been incredibly high. Maybe a couple percentage points more people are signing up for it, but everybody that was subscribing to it before was paying $200 a month. All of the subscriptions now are cut down by half. I'm guessing Tesla is still technically bringing in less revenue now than they were in the past due to full self-driving, and that's probably why they're not going to talk much about the uptake in FSD subscriptions on the next earnings call. They're just going to say, well, that's not really important. We just want to focus on the robo-taxis. Those are the real moneymakers, which is honestly still yet to be seen. I still feel like Tesla has a lot of regulatory loopholes to jump through, and it's going to be permitted on a city-by-city basis, so I don't see it rolling out at scale as quickly, probably as Elon thinks it will. And even my wife tried to use it a couple of times, and every time I would ask her, how did it do? She always said, pretty good. It always needed me to take over or did something weird or unnatural within just 5 to 10 minute drives, and that's what made her feel more comfortable driving herself, but nothing quite about it convinced us that it's worth the $99 a month. Yes, that's a much better price than $200 a month, but ultimately, you know, we bought an EV because we were tired of paying for gas, and it quickly feels like Tesla is coming up with more software services to try to increase all of our Tesla expenses to be about the same price of paying for gas anyway. You know, the higher registration costs, the higher insurance prices, the premium connectivity, and now they want to tack on $100 a month. Oh my god, can you imagine if, you know, Netflix or Disney Plus was asking you for that amount of money? And again, it might be a different story if it actually freed up more time, like subscribing to FSD resulted in you being able to watch a movie while the car was in motion, or go on your phone, or read a book, or even sleep. That's always been my dream. Just like lay back and let the car do all the driving. That would be a different story because it frees up a lot of time. But currently right now, when you still have to have your hand on the wheel and you still have to have your eyes on the road, it again doesn't really feel like that much is changing, because even when the system is on working properly, I still have to be like ready to take over at any time. To me, that absolutely kills a lot of the wow factor, because people are asking you, wait, is the car driving or are you driving? And you have to say, well, when the light is blue, that means the car's driving, but I do have to keep my hands here and I do have to keep looking at the road. And then everyone usually says, well, at that point, why don't you just drive the car yourself? It'd be kind of like if cruise control required your foot to be actively touching the pedal. It just wouldn't be as natural, it wouldn't be as convenient. But it sounds like Elon is in the process of trying to remove the steering wheel nag in FSD Supervised 12.4. I have a lot of questions about how well that's actually going to work. How strict does the eye tracking become? But I'll admit, if they got rid of the steering wheel nag, I would be far more tempted to actually start paying for it. Definitely not the $8,000, but $100 a month, a couple times a year when I have a big road trip, if it means I can just leave my hands off the wheel and I just have to watch the road like this, that might feel a lot more futuristic and cool. So here's hoping they're actually able to roll that out, and we might be having a different conversation when that feature is actually out there and ready to go. But what did you guys think of your free month of FSD Supervised? Feel free to drop your thoughts down in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.